Game recreations in GD have been around for quite a long time now. We've seen dozens of them, like Pac-Man by Samsar, VVVVV by Z-Jones, and also the Alter Game series by Serponge. These game mechanics are often pretty complex, but in my opinion there's one that stands out. It's not as difficult to make and can also be very versatile. I'm talking about the 4-directional mechanic. I actually used this on my level Music Factory, where I tried to recreate just shapes and beats in GD. And since then some people have been asking me how I made it, and so today we'll be going through step by step on how to make a 4-directional game mode. To make things simple, I've divided the whole process into 4 parts. And before we start with the switches, I'll set up a few things first. As always, group 1 will be for my invisible objects. I've put a block at the end so the level is not too short, and I've also changed some of the settings and made a few colors. One thing to keep in mind, however, is activating the 2 players mode, otherwise it's not going to work. With that said, we can actually start now. The way this mechanic works is, one player will switch directions and the other player will be in charge of the movements. So, whichever one you choose to make the movements with, in my case, the bottom one, you gotta turn it into a wave. You'll see why later. The top will be for the switches, you can just leave it as it is. Now, let's place 2 blocks that will follow the player's x-axis, and don't forget to put H and D blocks on them so they don't kill the player. We'll be using these square toggle orbs to make the direction switch, one for each direction. Let's add an individual group to them and also make them activate another group. Do not forget to check multi-activate though, this is important. I've put some numbers here to make it easier to visualize the groups. The green numbers are the groups that each trigger activates. These triggers only work when the player clicks on them, so let's move them all into the same place and make them follow the player, which is group number 2. Now, let's actually make their functionalities. They are going to be working in a loop, like the first trigger will activate the second one, the second trigger will activate the third one, and so on. To restart the loop, the last trigger must activate the first one again, so it's an infinite cycle. However, there can only be one trigger activated at any given time. So that means that if the first trigger is active right now and I press it, it has to activate the next group and also deactivate the group I just pressed. And why is that? Well, if there's 2 groups activated at the same time, you'll make the player move diagonally. So all you have to do here is add 2 triggers, one for activating the next and the other one for deactivating the trigger you just hit. In this case, activate group 4 and deactivate group 3. These toggle triggers will match the green numbers here, since they only turn on after I click on one of the square triggers. And also, these squares work as a spawn trigger, so don't forget to check spawn trigger and multi-trigger. Remember when I said that there can only be one group active at any given time? Well, let's make that happen. To do this, we can just toggle off these 3 right here, and that's all you have to do for the switches. When you play test it, we can see the triggers changing every time I click. Alright, now it's time to make some movements. The first thing we'll do is add a player, and put him on a new group, which is group 11. We'll be making the movements in this order, right, down, left, and up. So let's actually place some move triggers. You can always change these settings if you want the player to move faster or slower. After that, add each move trigger to a group. I'll also write down the number of each one to make it easier. By the way, don't forget the spawn trigger and the multi-trigger. But how are we actually going to make them move? Well, the answer is the collision trigger. There's a chance you've never used this trigger before, since it's very specific and doesn't really have much purpose on normal levels. But for minigames, this is the lifesaver. It's actually really simple how it works. So, if block A hits block B, the collision trigger will do something, like activating an object or just spawning another trigger. For example, I have these 2 blocks right here. The block that's going to move and collide with the others has to have dynamic block checked. I'm just making them move inside a collision trigger that says, if block 1 hits block 2, group 10 will be activated. And that's it. Now, here's where the wave game mode comes into play. We'll be setting a collision trigger here, and we'll follow both of the player's axes. Next up, make 2 collision blocks that will only follow the player's x-axis. Don't forget, the block that's following both axes has to have dynamic block checked. After giving separate IDs to all of them, you can start to add their functionalities. If the player presses the button, the wave will go up and hit block number 2. When that happens, the player in the minigame should move. So let's put this. If block 1 hits block 2, activate the trigger to move to the right, as long as the player holds the button. If the player releases the button, it's gonna go down and hit block number 3. So let's make it so if block 1 hits block 3, it's gonna activate a stop trigger that's gonna stop the movement. One little thing to keep in mind is, this set of collision blocks will only move to one direction, which in our case is to the right. And if the top player switches the direction, this set of blocks has to go away. So put them all on group 3, which is in charge of the first direction. After that, it should look something like this. You can see that when I change the directions, the little blocks disappear. However, there's only one problem with the system. If I change directions while moving with a wave, it's gonna keep moving to the right no matter what I do. Because well, block number 3 is not there anymore, so how are we gonna stop the movement? Well, it's pretty easy to fix this. All you have to do is put a stop trigger that activates when the top player changes the direction. In this case, it's on group number 7. And now it should work just fine. Alright then, that's the first direction done. To make the other ones, you can basically do the same thing. I'm gonna copy the collision blocks and put it on a different layer to make it easier to edit them. You have to always use new IDs for them and also change their group, which in this case is group number 4. Now just set new collision triggers. If block 4 hits block 5, activate the move trigger. If block 4 hits block 6, stop the move trigger. And don't forget this, if the top player changes directions, it has to stop the last move trigger, no matter if the wave is up or down. Otherwise, the bug we saw earlier will happen again. And now we have another direction finished. I'll fast forward a little bit, but you can see that it's the exact same process, only with fresh and new IDs for the blocks and different collision triggers. When you're done with all of them, your minigame should be looking like this. Now we can move on to the third step, blocks and obstacles. Let's add a wall here, and put some collision blocks in it. Also, we can't forget to put a collision block on the player. In this case, you'll have an ID of 14, and it must have dynamic block activated. Now we can set a collision trigger saying, if block 14 hits block 13, activate a stop trigger. This trigger will stop the current movement, so when the player collides with the wall, it's gonna stop. By the way, don't forget the spawn trigger and multi trigger. Alright, seems to be working. Never mind. Okay, if we keep it like this, you'll be able to go through the walls. This is because the blocks are already colliding, and so it won't activate again. To fix this, we need to push the player back. This is pretty easy. All you have to do is set a trigger that moves the player in the opposite direction when the player hits the wall. Since it's moving to the right, you must push the player to the left. Just a quick push. You can copy these settings if you want. As you can see, I'm spamming the button and it's still working just fine. So all of these triggers and collision blocks is only going to work on one direction. We have to set new triggers for the other ones. We can start by putting a new block on the player, this time with an ID of 15. By the way, the player's collision blocks will also work in a loop. We'll start by having the ID 14 activated, and if we change the directions, ID 15 will toggle on, and 14 will be toggled off, and so on. Next, we set up the new triggers up here. It's the same formula. If you want, you can just copy the last triggers and just change the groups and settings. After doing this for all the 4 directions, you are ready to move on to the last part, which is spikes and enemies. If you made it this far, you can just relax, because this is the easiest part. Let's start by adding a red block here. If the player touches this block, it's game over. The collision block for the hazards will have ID 18. Now just put some spikes following the actual player, and toggle them off at the beginning. These spikes will only toggle on again if the player collides with the red block. Also, because the player collision block is always changing with the direction, you can just put a new and permanent one. This block will always be active, no matter the direction the player is heading. It will have an ID of 19. After that, just set a collision block that says, if block 19 hits block 18, activate the spikes. And there we go. We can see that the player in the minigame is still moving after we die, and that doesn't look very good. To fix it, just put a death trigger and activate all the stop triggers. Basically, when the player dies, it will automatically stop all the move triggers on every direction. Well, that's it for the basics. Now you can just let your creativity flow. I made my own minigame for this video, and before I show it to you, I need to address this bug. So if you put a shake trigger in your level, there's a high chance that it's gonna break the movement system. That's because the collision blocks that are following the player's y-axis, it's gonna disconnect from the player, and because it's a fixed pattern, it won't go back to the player's position. Fortunately though, there's a trigger called follow player's y, and you can just replace that move trigger with this new one. The difference is that this trigger locks on the player, so even if it disconnects, it's gonna immediately come back to its position. You can follow the player's X with the move trigger, but use this trigger for the Y-axis. This was the only little glitch I found while making my level. If you're having trouble with anything else, please leave it in the comments and hopefully we can find a solution together. With this out of the way, let's see the final results. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and if you like the content, then a sub to the channel will be much appreciated. And as always, thanks for watching.